Climate activist Seth Klein has released a new book. It's called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. It's creating a lot of ripples in my circles, lots of debate and a lot of interest. So we're going to talk to Seth about his book. Welcome to the interview, Seth.
Nice to be with you.
Now, look, we've only got 7 to 10 minutes and we've got a lot of ground to cover. So why don't you give us an overview of your argument, please?
Well, the book is really a roadmap for Canada, an action plan, a battle plan, if you will, for how we rise to this climate emergency moment. When I set out to undertake the book, I really wanted to tackle what do we do about this gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And I had always planned to have a chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I'd always been intrigued by that as an example of rapid economic retooling. But the more I delved into that, the more I started to see more and more parallels, not just on the economic front, but in terms of how was public opinion marshaled, how was Confederation navigated, what did we do for returning soldiers as a model for just transition for fossil fuel workers, the role of civil society and youth, Indigenous communities. So I ended up structuring the whole book around lessons from the Second World War. And I'm basically saying, look, this was the last time we faced an existential threat. We mobilized across society. This is how we did it. And I think there's some lessons here for the present.
Give me the top couple of lessons, please.
Well, one lesson, a key lesson is you spend what it takes to win. And that's what we did in the Second World War. That's also what our federal government has been doing in the face of the pandemic. It is decidedly not what it's doing with respect to the climate emergency. A second is that you create new economic institutions to get the job done. This to me was one of the most intriguing examples out of the Second World War. I became quite fascinated with C.D. Howe, who was called the Minister of Everything. He was the Minister for Munitions and Supply, overseeing this incredible ramp up on the home front in terms of military production. And he was no lefty. He was on the right wing of the Mackenzie King government, but he was really seized with the task. And he created 28 crown corporations during the war in order to expedite that military production. He also carefully coordinated all of the supply chains, so he appointed controllers to coordinate all the key inputs, machine tools, rubber, silk, timber, fuel, you name it. And so I think we need to do that again. We need to ask what's the new generation of crown corporations that we need to scale up what has to be done? What are the new I propose a new federal transfer program called the A Just Transition Climate Emergency Transfer to help to expedite that. Another lesson is around the connection with inequality. There's lots of climate folks, I'm sure you've interviewed many of them, who say, look, don't mix climate with inequality or social justice. This is complicated enough. And I respectfully disagree because first of all, these issues are linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But also a key lesson out of the Second World War is that if you're going to mobilize the whole of society, inequality is toxic to the social solidarity that you need to do that. And the King government understood that. And they did dramatic things to offset that. And so that's another key lesson.
Now, I remember when we were in the lead up to the October 2019 federal election, the parties released their climate plans, and on the most aggressive clearly was the Green Party. Elizabeth May talked in exactly the same kind of terms you did, mobilizing around like it was the Second World War, and then the NDP was aggressive. Then you had the Liberals, which a lot of people said was pretty good climate policy, and then you had the CPC, which was poor climate policy.
Right.
So I think we're in agreement on that. So to paraphrase Mackenzie King, is your argument and the Green Party's argument, is it basically the Liberals in a hurry?
In some ways, although I would say, I was pleased that the Green Party used the same frame around lessons from the Second World War. And yet I would not have called the Green Party platform a climate emergency program. So let me kind of come back to your last question. When I'm asked out of this exercise, how do you know when a government or a party is actually in emergency mode? Well, for me, there's four markers. Are they spending what it takes to win? Are they creating new economic institutions? Are they moving from voluntary to mandatory measures as needed? And are they talking about it like it's a real emergency? Are they being forthright and telling the truth about what we actually need to do? I actually don't think any of the political parties hit all four of those markers, including the Green Party. So at some level, I'm pressing them all. But here's the hopeful piece of it too. Any one of them are capable of pivoting into that emergency mode once they really get it, right? If you had asked Canadians in 1938, does Mackenzie King and his cabinet, do they have the fellows there who have it in them to transform Canadian society the way they ultimately did? I think most Canadians would have said no. And if you'd asked me 10 months ago, do we have the people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada who could quickly pivot in the face of a pandemic and create these audacious programs like the wage subsidy and the CERB? You know, I probably cynically would have said no too. I would have said there's nobody home, and I would have been wrong. So you never know who's actually able to shift into that mode.
Well, if we're looking for the modern C.D. Howe, the first name that pops into my head is Mark Carney. And are there any others?
Well, I mean, C.D. Howe was an engineer, not a finance guy, which I think actually was relevant. You know, he liked technology and he liked to build, and he brought that spirit to the task at hand. And then he recruited over 100 of these $1-a-year men, these senior executives from the private sector, to head up these crown corporations and to serve as controllers. And in some ways, I think that's where, you know, Mark Carney is a bit of a modern $1-a-year man. And that's the role he's playing, as I understand it, with the United Nations. And we need to enlist a lot more folks like that. And we need to then find politicians who are prepared to really be seized with the task the way C.D. Howe was. And I'm not sure. At the federal level, in the cabinet, I don't see that person right now.
Now, Seth, we had a conversation before the interview started, and we're going to be having we're doing a podcast, you and I. We'll have you on Energy Talks next week, and we're going to have a fulsome conversation about this, because you and I, while we agree on some things like the climate crisis, we probably disagree on some other areas. So we're going to have an adult conversation, as we're wont to say. So one of the things that I will discuss, and I think we might agree on this one, is that the energy and climate narrative in Canada needs to change. And I look at it as primarily energy journalist and somebody who writes about the energy transition a lot. And I think that our energy narrative is woefully, woefully inadequate. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Oh, it's definitely inadequate. I mean, the basic level of energy and climate literacy in Canada is appalling, right? Like, only half of Canadians or thereabouts correctly attribute the main source of global warming to be the combusting of fossil fuels. Now, if with literacy levels that low, that's an incredible indictment of the mainstream media and our political leaders in terms of their failure to do some basic education and to have the conversation that needs to be had. It also it results in some very contradictory results in the polling, right? So on the one hand, the good news is you find polling results where the public is saying, yes, it's an emergency and we definitely need bold action. And the very same people will say, yes, we're also supportive of new fossil fuel infrastructure and continuing to expand fossil fuel production. Well, how can you hold such contradictory views? Well, you can hold such contradictory views when you don't know that the source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Well, okay, that's very interesting, and now I for sure I'm looking forward to the Energy Talks discussion that we're going to have. And one of the points that I will make, and I'll bring it up here just briefly, is the role of the market. And one of the I've interviewed, I don't know how many, several dozen anyway, experts economists and engineers and executives across North America about electricity market reform. And I know you've written, because I read your Dogwood piece with John Calvert about that, about BC's electrical system. And my take on what you're arguing is that we need more sort of that crown corporation, less of the private sector in the market. And everybody else I talk to says, no, we need more of the market, and we need to be able to, that's how we're going to integrate renewables into our grid system. And so is that a fundamental disagreement, or am I misunderstanding your argument?
I think a little bit, well, it's a bit of both. So I think the private sector has an important role to play. And I think the private sector had an important role to play in the Second World War. What the private sector didn't get to do in the Second World War, and lots of people had a role and they made lots of money. What they didn't get to do is allocate is to decide on the allocation of scarce resources. We didn't leave that to the market or price signals, because in an emergency, you don't do that. C.D. Howe did that in order to get the job done. And if we had left it to the market to produce what needed to be produced in the Second World War, we would not have succeeded, right? Let me give you one example out of the Americans, right? Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. And for the next 4 years, the production and sale of the private automobile was basically illegal. Now, those plants remained very busy, producing all manner of military vehicles. But it wasn't left to the executives of those companies to make that call. They were told what had to be produced. And so I have great hope, as you do, in the technology that now exists and is ready to roll, and the innovation that's heard there, and I'm great help that has happened there, and I'm grateful for it. But my belief is that if it is now to be manufactured and deployed at the speed and scale that is now required, and we are to leave that to price signals to produce that outcome, we're fried. That's my fear.
Okay, fair argument, and I look forward to chatting with you about that next week on Energy Talks. Thank you very much, Seth. The book again is A Global War, A Good War.
Yes.
Good War. There we go. Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And thank you very much, Seth. We'll chat next week.
Thanks.